Hi everybody, Dr. Joe Dispenza here. I wanted to take a moment before we begin this journey and give you an understanding of how we arrived at this formula that we'll be talking about through the course of this series. The formula is a combination of brain coherence and heart coherence, and when you combine those two, you have a more effective ability to be able to affect your body, your mind, and ultimately your life. So let me take you on a journey on how I discovered this whole process. In 1986, I was in a triathlon in Palm Springs, California. I was on the biking portion of the race, and I was making a turn to merge to the right. And as I was approaching this corner, there were two cyclists on the corner, and I was passing those cyclists, and there was a police officer on the corner, and he was pointing at me, and he was telling me to make this turn and to merge with this the direction of the traffic. And as I was making this turn, passing these two bikers, he had his back to the traffic, and there was a four-wheel drive vehicle going very fast, and it caught me from behind and catapulted me out of my bicycle. As a result of that, landing hard on the ground, the compression, the forces of compression caused 6 vertebrae in my spine to break: T8, T9, T10, T11, T12, and L1. And when you land that hard, the compression of the downward forces collapses the bodies of the vertebrae. Picture them as pillars. And when you compress the volume like that, the volume has to go somewhere. And in my case, it went back onto my spinal cord. The athoracic vertebrae, the arch where the spinal cord passes through, had broken like a pretzel. So I had multiple compression fractures of my spine. I had bone fragments on the cord, and I had the neural arch of the athoracic vertebrae compressing the cord. So in typical cases like this, there's a radical surgery that's done called the Harrington rod surgery, where they take off the back parts of your vertebrae and they screw in these long stainless steel rods, and the rods act as a cantilever to pull the spine off the cord. They cut open your hip and they take fragments of the bone and they paste it over the top to secure it so bone grows over it. And I had 4 opinions from 4 of the leading surgeons in Southern California. And at the time, they told me that I probably would never walk again and that the surgery was my only option. Well, in 1986, you didn't really tell surgeons that you were going to seek an alternative method, but after 4 opinions, I went against the surgical recommendations, and I thought, well, I'm not going anywhere, I'm not doing anything. I'm basically laying face down, and let me see if I could influence my body with my mind. And it sounds really easy philosophically, theoretically, intellectually, but when you're faced with crisis, when you're faced with trauma, when you're faced with some stressor in your life, we tend to focus on the worst case scenario. In other words, what we don't want to have happen instead of what we do want to have happen. And so I was a young guy in my 20s, and I had no reference. I was weighing what I knew from a medical understanding against what I didn't know, what was possible. And I began my journey. And for the first 6 weeks, I thought, I'm going to close my eyes, and I believe there's an intelligence within the body that's giving us life. It's keeping our heart beating, it's digesting our food, it's organizing all these metabolic functions behind the scenes of our awareness. And I thought, maybe I can make contact with this intelligence and give it a plan, give it a template, give it a design. And when I was completely satisfied with my creative design, then I would surrender the creation of what I created to this greater mind and allow it to do the healing, because certainly I didn't know how to do it. Well, those first 6 weeks were a dark night of the soul for me, because I couldn't get my mind to do what I wanted it to do. And I believed that it was paying attention to me. And so I would start by reconstructing my spine, vertebrae per vertebrae. And then the next thing I know, I would go unconscious and I would be thinking about living in a wheelchair, or if I should sell my practice, or if I should sell my home. And I catch myself right in the middle of my creative design, and I realized that I didn't want that particular input to be the outcome. So I'd back up and I'd start all over again. But this time I'd be frustrated, I'd be impatient, I'd be angry, and then I noticed that it got harder. And I went through this process for those 6 weeks, and it would take me sometimes up to 3 hours. And when I was finished, I never felt satisfied that I really did it properly. But I guess it was enough for me to continue. And the other thing I said was I wasn't going to let any thought slip by my awareness that I didn't want to experience. And that sounds easy also. But over the course of those 6 weeks, I would keep catching myself going to the worst case scenario in my mind. I would keep watching my mind lose its attention span and lose its focus, and I would start over again. And after about 6 weeks, I started to notice that it started getting easier. I could control my mind a little bit more. I was able to stay present. I was able to go through the entire process with more ease, and it would take less time. And what I didn't know that I was improving my ability to pay attention, which is a skill, and the more you practice it, the better you get at it. I was learning how to overcome some emotions that are connected to the hormones of stress. And I was firing and wiring different circuits in my brain by repetition. And over time, the more I fired and wired, the more I was installing the neurological hardware of my brain. And the hardware started to become a software program. It started to become more automatic. It started to become more easy. And I remember this one morning, it was about 6.5 weeks into my injury, I went through the entire process and I never lost my focus from start to finish, reconstructing every vertebrae. And when I finished it, it felt like I had hit a tennis ball right in the sweet spot. I hit a golf ball just right. Something clicked. I clicked. There was a change that I noticed. And it felt right. And what normally took me 3 hours to do, I was able to do in 45 minutes. It was able to run through the whole entire process, and it seemed a lot easier. And right around that time, I started to notice significant changes in my body. I started to notice a lot of my pain going down. I noticed that I started feeling more sensations in my legs. I started to notice that I had more motor function, and I started to notice my body responding to my mind. Now, this was a critical moment for me because the moment I noticed changes that were taking place outside of me in my body from what I was doing inside of me, I started paying more attention to what I was doing inside of me, and I started doing it again, doing it with more excitement, more enthusiasm, more inspiration, because now I knew I was making a difference. And now I started to look forward to doing this process instead of sometimes resisting it. And so now I had all this extra time, and I started thinking about things that I would love to do. I started thinking about watching the sunset again. I just realized how I took that for granted, and I started thinking about taking a shower or sitting at a table with my friends and eating lunch again. And those were the things that mattered the most to me, the simple things. And when I would finish my rehearsal of reconstructing my spine from start to finish without breaking my focus, I basically was saying to that intelligence that is always present with us, that I had to be present with it, take a look at this design. And I wanted it to know exactly what I wanted, and then when I was satisfied with it, I would just release it. I would let it go. I would surrender it to this mind. I started to select those possibilities that existed as potentials in my future. And when I thought about watching the sunset or taking a warm shower again because I couldn't, I would start to emotionally embrace those futures before they occurred. And I didn't know what I was doing at the time, but I can tell you that my body started to believe I was living in that future reality in the present moment. It's so objective that when we're truly present, it doesn't know the difference between the real life experience of watching a sunset and feeling the emotion and the emotion that I was fabricating by thought alone. And it was the process of doing this that I believe began to make significant changes in my biology. I started to notice a lot of things changing. 10.5 weeks, I was back on my feet, and I was back in my office seeing patients at 12 weeks. And I knew then that on some level that I had made significant strides in what I was doing. And they wanted to cast me in a full body cast, and they had all these restrictions for me. But when I got back on my feet at 10 and a half weeks, I knew the day I was to stand up. I just knew it. When I knew I was healed, I put on that brace for about 5 minutes and realized there was no way I was going to live with this brace. And so it started a journey for me. I noticed that I was healed on some level. I had no pain in my spine. I had no motor dysfunction. I had no sensory problems. I had no pain in my lower back. I just felt better. And I started asking bigger questions like, how could this possibly happen? What did I do to make a difference in my body? And I started studying. I went to the local university, University of Washington, and I went to the library and I started looking in all these medical texts for answers to some of the questions I was asking. How does bone regenerate itself? Is it possible? I know the body can heal, and I know the power that made the body heals the body. And I knew that I had made contact with this intelligence, but how did it happen? What was the science behind it? And I couldn't find any of those solutions in any medical references that were conventional medical and scientific references. And so I had to start looking outside convention, and I started studying this concept called neuroplasticity, where it says that we're not hardwired to be a certain way for the rest of our lives, that the brain is adaptable and it's changeable and we can rewire our brain. I started studying some of that research, and I started studying epigenetics, that we're not doomed by our genes, that we are really marvels of adaptability and change, and we could literally signal new genes and change our expression of gene potential. And I started thinking about how the mind influenced the body, and I had to study psychoneuroimmunology, neurochemistry, and neurohormones. And then, of course, it led me to quantum physics and how subjective mind has an effect on the objective world. And I started this journey of understanding my own personal transformation. And I think after you have an initiation like this, and this was my initiation, it was my wake-up call. In fact, I wouldn't be sitting here today if it didn't happen to me. I think when you have moments like this in your life and you have some transcendence of your conditions and you have a breakthrough, I don't think you can go back to business as usual. I don't think you could go back to being the same person again. And I was, in a lot of ways, the changed young man. And so I started my journey in looking to find answers, and did my best to combine both the spiritual understanding of what happened to me with the science. And so after a period of time, I started studying spontaneous remissions. I wanted to understand if there were other people that had same or similar conditions that were treating conventionally or unconventionally, and they were staying the same or getting worse, and all of a sudden they got better. And I wanted to know if there was a cause that somehow produced the effect. And so I interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people that had some type of spontaneous remission. And over time, I began to realize that those changes weren't so spontaneous after all, that there was some effect. And after interviewing many people, I found that there were 4 common things that I just want to briefly talk to you about, that they all had in common that had some effect on their physical body. Number 1, they all believed that there was an intelligence within them that was giving them life. That was that same intelligence that I just talked about. And its function is for balance, restoration, repair, and regeneration. It is to maintain the body in its balance. And all of those biological functions that you and I take for granted are under the control of the autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system is the automatic nervous system. And so they all believed that there was some intelligence that was giving them life, and they all believed that somehow, whatever you want to call that intelligence, they had to take time to begin to make contact with it and to begin to give it a specific design, just like I did. And again, once again, surrender their creation to this automatic mind that does the healing for us. The second thing they had in common is on some level they began to take responsibility for their own health. They started to say, what was my state of mind and body that may have contributed to this disease, whether it was cancer, MS, thyroid condition. What was it that I had been doing for the last 10 years or last 20 years that could have had an effect on it? What were the thoughts that I was thinking? What were the actions or habits that I went unconscious to? How did I speak? And they looked at certain emotions that they lived by that they may have mismanaged, and they started to become conscious of those unconscious states of mind and body. And this was an important element because this was the process of breaking the habit of being themselves. In other words, they started realizing that it was their unconscious thoughts and feelings and behaviors that had some effect on their body. And if they thought, well, if I was thinking, acting, and feeling this way, if I start to change my thoughts, if I start to change how I speak, how I act, if I could begin to give up certain emotions that keep me connected to the past and start feeling differently, would it begin to produce an effect in my body? And they began their own personal journey of changing from one state into another. I thought that was really important because when I started studying this, I realized that mind had the most dramatic effect on the body. And I went back to school and started studying neuroscience in more detail. And I started to discover that there is a very strong correlation between how we think, because every thought we think produces a chemical. That chemical signals our body to feel certain ways. When we have an unhappy thought, we feel unhappy. The moment we feel unhappy, the brain is always monitoring what the body's doing, and we begin to think more unhappy thoughts equal to the way we're feeling. And people get caught in these loops of thinking and feeling, and it's the redundancy of that cycle over time that creates the person's state of being. Now, it only takes a thought and a feeling, a stimulus and a response, a memory and an emotion to begin the conditioning process. And so it was an important time for people when they were beginning to break that cycle, they were willing to go through the discomfort that went along with it and start to believe that there was a new way of being. The third thing they had in common is they started thinking about who they did want to be. This is a really important moment because this started my whole journey. They would close their eyes and do their best to make contact with that intelligence, become conscious of their unconscious thoughts, notice their behaviors from the past, and look at the emotions they were feeling. And they just wanted to become so conscious of those states of mind and body that they wouldn't go unconscious the entire day. And they started thinking about, if I had another lease on life, if I had another opportunity at life, if I could start all over again, who would I be? Now, this is an important question because they started thinking about what thoughts they did want to put their attention behind. They started reviewing how they wanted to act. And when they were in the process of rehearsing who they wanted to be when they opened their eyes, or who they wanted to be in their new life, they were so focused and so present that the brain didn't know the difference between the real life experience that was creating the emotion, or the real life experience that was creating the event, and what they were imaging in their mind. And they started to, through mental rehearsal, begin to install new neurological hardware that ultimately became the platform of their identity. And it started me on the journey of studying this concept called mental rehearsal in more detail. And they didn't wait for their healing to begin to feel joy and to feel gratitude and to feel wholeness. They understood that they had to feel wholeness and gratitude and joy for their healing to begin. And so they went through this process of reinventing a new self. When they did this properly, they started to notice changes in their body. They started to notice they started to feel better every day. And the act of doing it repetitively every day caused them to feel better every day, and ultimately they became better. The last thing they had in common is that when they were in this inward process, they had long moments where they had lost track of time and space. In other words, in that inward journey, when they finished, they thought it maybe had been 20 minutes that went by, and it was an hour and 20 minutes. And they all of a sudden altered their perception of time. And when you and I are truly focused and we're inward, and we do this properly, we turn on the frontal lobe, which is the crowning achievement of the human being. That's the creative center of the brain. And the frontal lobe acts like a volume control. When we're paying attention to what we're doing and we're present, the frontal lobe doesn't want to be disturbed or distracted by any other external stimuli. So it lowers the volume to the circuits in the brain that cause us to process space and time. And that gives us the ability to be so present that time and space disappear. And so that understanding for me was a really significant understanding, because it helped me understand that we can really change from the inside out. So I wrote a book called Evolve Your Brain, and then there was a documentary called What the Bleep Do We Know, and that became a very popular documentary and opened people's mind up to what was possible as human beings. But when I was touring with the scientists and researchers that were in this movie, I started paying attention to the questions people asked when we were doing these seminars around the world. And they kept asking, our thoughts have some effect on our bodies, our thoughts have some effect on our minds, our thoughts have some effect on our lives. Okay, how do you do it? And I thought that was a great question. And the second thing is, if your personality creates your personal reality, and in order to create a new personal reality, you have to change your personality. Well, how do we change? And why is it so hard to change? And I thought that was a really great question. And the third question was, what do you do? And so we started teaching these seminars and one-day workshops around the world, giving people the understanding, basic understanding of quantum physics and neuroscience and neuroendocrinology and psychoneuroimmunology and epigenetics and electromagnetism and brain waves, and piecing together this model of understanding based on my own personal experience, as well as what I had researched and what I understood. And I thought, my goodness, if it worked on sick people, if these were the things that people did in order to get well, if it's true, then we should be able to reproduce it. And then what if, not only if it worked on sick people, what if we helped people just change that weren't sick? Could that model also work? And so in these one-day workshops, we wanted to give people the understanding of how it was possible. And we taught these workshops for about a year, and then we started teaching second levels and third levels and more advanced workshops. And right after about 2 years, all of a sudden, we started seeing very significant changes in people's lives and very significant changes in people's health. I remember the moment I watched a woman with MS that was confined to a wheelchair for about 10 years, after one meditation, stand up out of that wheelchair and start to walk around. Actually, she was dancing around. And I realized right in that moment that something happened to that person. In other words, what happened biologically? What happened scientifically? Was there a change in gene expression? Was there a change in mind? What did she do that began to affect her body? And all of a sudden, I just could not go back to business as usual. There was too many questions that I had asked, and too much evidence now, because we started seeing it more and more as we kept teaching these workshops. And I thought, okay, now we're starting to see these changes. Let's organize a team of scientists and researchers and begin to do some measurements. And so I wrote another book called Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself, and that was more of the how-to, teach people the beginning stages of how to change, how to unlearn and relearn, how to break the habit of their old self and reinvent a new self, how to prune synaptic connections and sprout new connections, how to deprogram and reprogram, unfire and unwire, refire and rewire, to lose your mind and create a new one. How do we unmemorize emotions that keep us connected to the past and then recondition the body to a new mind and to a new emotion that keeps us believing in a new future? And so we organized this team of scientists, and we started doing brain scans. We started doing quantitative EEGs. We were taking measurements of people that would come to our events, go through 4 days of training or 4.5 days of training, and then we would scan their brain at the end, and we wanted to see that changes weren't just in their mind, that they were in fact in their brain. And then we started doing something really important, is we started measuring people's brains in real time during a meditation to see any fundamental clues that could help us understand their inner workings. And we gained so much knowledge about the process of change and transformation. We measured heart rate variability. We know that when a person is resentful, when they're impatient, when they're frustrated, their heart beats very differently compared to when they're in a state of gratitude or joy or inspiration, or feeling care and kindness. We measured the energy of the room. We wanted to see if a collective group of people could begin to affect the environment around them, the energy in the room. We measured the energy fields around their body. We measured the energy centers of their body because we did certain things to influence those individual energy centers that are under the control of the autonomic nervous system. We measured gene expression. We now know that you can change your gene expression in 4 days. We measured immune regulation. We wanted to see if people gave up those emotions of stress and went into more elevated emotions, if it would strengthen their immune system, if it gave them more energy for growth and repair. We measured telomere lengths. We wanted to see if people could sustain the proper homeostasis and balance and self-regulate and do meditations every day for 60 days, only 5 out of 7 days a week, if it began to change their telomeres, the little shoestring caps on the end of the DNA that determine your biological age. And we saw that 3 out of 4 people that did their meditations on a regular basis changed their genetic destiny. They changed their future. And if you asked me over 10, 12 years ago if I thought that I would be seeing the changes that I'm currently seeing presently, I probably would have told you maybe once or twice, but there's been a huge shift. There has been a significant change. There's been a movement, and there's a momentum of people that are beginning to understand what they're doing and why they're doing it. And I now know that when you give people sound scientific information, and science is the contemporary language of mysticism. It's science that demystifies the mystical. And once they can understand it and they can learn it, they're forging new connections in their brain. That's what learning is. If they have a model of understanding that they can theoretically begin to process in their mind and it makes sense to them, the research shows that if you don't review that information that you've learned, if you don't repeat it, if you don't think about it over and over again, the circuits that you've just forged will weaken and they'll prune apart and you won't remember. So if learning is making new synaptic connections, then remembering is maintaining them. So if a person can explain that to somebody and they can build that model with someone else and they can explain that model, they're beginning to install the neurological hardware in their brain in preparation for the experience. And as I said, the more they understand what they're doing, the more they understand why they're doing it, the how tends to get easier and they can assign meaning to the process. So we started putting people through this process, and then I thought, well, if we can set up the conditions in the environment and give them the proper instructions, a certain percentage of the people will get their behaviors to match their intentions. They'll get their actions equal to their thoughts. When they get their mind and body working together, they'll have a new experience, and that experience then enriches the philosophical circuits in their brain. And the moment those neurons begin to organize into networks, the brain makes a chemical, and that chemical is called a feeling or an emotion. So the payoff from every experience is that chemical signature called an emotion. And so the moment they started to feel empowered, the moment they started to feel more unlimited, the more they started to feel free, the more they started to feel grateful from some experience, they were teaching their body chemically to understand what their mind is intellectually understood. I started to realize that knowledge is for the mind and experience is for the body. And I started to see that people started to embody the truth of that philosophy from the experience. And that was the information that began to select and instruct new genes. And they started to change on a very basic level. But if you can do it once, then you should be able to repeat the experience. And the repetition of any experience neurochemically conditions the mind and body to begin to work as one. In other words, when you've done something so many times that your body now knows how to do it better than your mind, now it becomes innate in you. It's second nature. It's easy. It's familiar. You're mastering that philosophy now. It becomes you. You become that knowledge. And so I thought, my goodness, if we could capture that process of transformation and do the measurements, and we could interpret what those measurements are, we would have more information to teach transformation again. And if we could measure even more transformation. We'd gather more information to teach transformation. We could close the gap between knowledge and experience, and that's what I wanted. So then I wrote another book called You Are the Placebo, more about how the mind influences the body. And then at a certain point, I finally wrote another book called Becoming Supernatural, and I started to gather all of the things that we were doing at these 4.5-day events and to put them in a methodical way of teachings for people to have access, to have the tools that they need to begin to make significant strides or changes in their own lives. And so since that time and on this journey, we've discovered so many really important things that I want to talk to you about in this series. I can tell you that without a doubt that when you are analyzing your life or analyzing yourself within some disturbing emotion, and that emotion is derived from the hormones of stress. In other words, if you're feeling frustrated or angry or resentful or jealous or envious or competitive or fearful or worried or depressed or in pain or you're suffering or guilty or shameful, when you're living by those emotions and you start analyzing yourself or your life within those emotions, we saw that 100% of the time you'll make your brain worse, because in a sense those emotions are a record of the past, so you're thinking in the past. And secondly, the arousal of those chemicals drives your brain further and further into these more agitated or aroused states. I can tell you that it takes a long time for your personality to change your personality, that the ego takes a long time to change the ego, that the programs that we develop over time that become our identity have very little effect in changing programs, that the brain takes a long time to change the brain, that we started realizing that when people really understand how to become conscious, that the act of becoming more conscious and more aware elevates us outside of the program. In other words, we're no longer the program when we can observe who we've been. And so we started this journey with the interest in seeing what type of effects the mind and body have when they're working together. And we started to give people all those necessary tools for them to begin to practice in their lives. And over time, in these last 10 years or so, we have seen people heal themselves from stage 4 cancers many, many times. We've seen people heal themselves of MS, of rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, ALS, PLS. We've seen them heal from Parkinson's disease, traumatic brain injuries, brain tumors. We've seen them heal from endometriosis, Graves' disease, Hashimoto's syndrome, high liver enzymes, low liver enzymes, colorectal cancer, diverticulitis, impotence, prostatic conditions. We've seen leukemia go into remission, and this is like a 4-minute mile. The 4-minute mile was once considered physically impossible to do, and to run a mile under 4 minutes, until somebody did it. And once that person did it, within 2 weeks another person did it, and then there's been over 1,400 people since that time that have broken the 4-minute mile. And what it is, it's a belief system. It's a level of consciousness that changes a culture in what's possible. And I think that we have so much great evidence now in our scientific measurements that you can change your gene expression, that you can rewire your brain, that you can make your brain work better, you can make your heart work better, you can change your energy, you can strengthen your immune system, you could heal, you can lengthen your life, you can change your brain chemistry. So we have the evidence in our scientific measurements to show what is possible. But we also have evidence and testimony that it's so important when a person in an event walks on the stage and tells their story of how they overcame stage 4 cancer. And it's not a glamorous story that's a Hollywood version. It's a real-life person that tells you their account of their own personal change and transformation and the things they had to do in order to heal. And I look out in the audience many times when people are on the stage telling their story, and I'm watching people in the audience while they're standing in the presence of truth. In other words, that person who's telling their story is the living example of truth. When they're listening to that person tell their story, I'm watching everybody. They're all leaning in because this is evidence. This is testimony. This is a person that actually did it. And they don't look any different than anybody else. In fact, they look just like a normal person. And they're paying attention to what they're saying because this is not on television. This isn't on a commercial. This isn't some movie that they're watching. This is a real person. And when you see a person with 50 brain tumors stand on the stage and you see their scans, or you see a before and after scans, or you see a blind person from a stroke that was diagnosed as clinically blind, all of a sudden able to see, and you see the measurements of the change in the optic nerve function. When you see the tumor shrink 75% and you see the radiographic studies, there's evidence right in front of you. And this person's telling the story. That is the 4-minute mile. That's the person who's saying, I just ran a mile under 4 minutes. I just healed myself of this rare genetic disorder. And there's always someone in the audience that relates with them. There's always someone in the audience that says, well, if that person can do it, so could I. And we are piercing this veil of consciousness that tells us that we are far greater than we think. We are more powerful than we know, or more unlimited than we could ever dream. And my interest is to give people my greatest understanding of the truth from a scientific perspective, and numerous opportunities to experience it, nothing more. And we begin to lay footprints in consciousness. We begin to lay footprints in the quantum field that is information, that is memory in the field that says this experience now is available for other people. And when you see a person in three-dimensional reality who has healed themselves, you can't stop thinking about that person and what they did. And now you start believing in yourself. You start believing in possibility. And when you believe in yourself, you have to believe in possibility. And when you believe in possibility, you have to believe in yourself. So fast forward to today. We did 19 4.5-day events where we took enormous amounts of time to do all these scientific measurements. And then I realized that people were starting just to break through on those very last days of those 4.5 days, and we sent them home. And I started thinking, wow, why don't we do week-long events? What if we had people for a whole week and they could retreat from their lives and go from philosopher to initiating that philosophy, to initiate to mastering that philosophy, from knowledge to experience to wisdom, from mind to body to soul, from thinking to doing to being, giving them numerous opportunities to practice, learning it with your head, applying it with your hands, knowing it by heart. And so we started doing these week-long events, and it is the week-long events where we see the most significant changes. We've done 20 week-long events over the last 2 years, and I can tell you I have witnessed miracles that I never thought I would see in my lifetime. And there's a movement now that's happening. There's a momentum happening. And we've distilled it down after all the research into a very simple formula. And that formula is learning how to manage your brain and your mind and create more order or coherence in your brain, and learning how to self-regulate with your emotions and be able to change your emotional state on command so that you're not out of balance in your life. And to teach people then how to get beyond their identity, to get beyond their personality that's connected to their present personal reality, and the process of getting beyond themselves and creating from the field instead of from matter to matter begins to exert greater changes in their mind and their body and in their life. And so this series is about teaching you that process. I hope you enjoy it.